Close. We'll get things kicked off. So first of all, welcome, and to all the Americans in the house, happy Thanksgiving. A few, all right, good. So I'm Randy Knaflick. I head up Google's recruiting machine here in EMEA, and I'm based here in Zurich. And I just wanted to, I get the pleasure and the honor of introducing our guest this evening. And since we have all of you here, I thought it'd be a good chance to just spend just a couple of minutes, because some of you may or may not be familiar with this search company called Google. So I'll do my best to give you a little education on that, but probably it's better just to tell you a little bit about Google here in Zurich, Switzerland. So we've actually been here for over, nearly 4 years now, and started with actually one engineer. And we have the host of having actually that one engineer in the front row. So if you're interested in seeing how you go from one engineer to a site that's over 350 in a very short time, he can tell you how it's expanded quickly, and I can tell you, I had a little bit more hair when this all started. So Google's idea was to basically take the model that worked really well in Mountain View, the engineering model that worked there, and basically recognizing that there's this one little fact, that is, there are a lot of engineers in the world, and guess what? They don't all sit in Mountain View, California. So believe it or not, they decided they wanted to bring this model a little bit closer to the masses, and Zurich was the first site where they decided to do that. And since then, we've actually grown to having 12 engineering sites throughout EMEA, and a number of different locations in all the major cities that have engineering talent. And it's worked really well, and so having the engineering sites in these locations is enabling us to do things both for the global market and for the local market. So most of you are here in Zurich, and whether you knew this or not, next time you're on Google, check out Google Maps and all those really cool things that you can do, like see what time the bus outside the Hurlimann area that comes every, I think it's 4 days. It's a really bad schedule on that. But you would see that schedule, and that was done by our engineers here, not the bus schedule, the letting you know when it'll come. We're working on that as well. We'll get back to you on that. So we're continuing to grow, and we'll continue to tap into the talent that is in not only Switzerland but beyond. This site is very special, and it's probably no secret that Zurich's a great place to live, and we're able to attract a lot of talent from all over. In fact, we have over 42 different countries represented just in this one location. Actually, I should say 2 locations, because this is now our second site that all of you will have an opportunity. Those who opted for a tour will get to see our new site here in the Hurlimann area. So that leads us to the next step, which is actually we have a returning visitor and our guest and honorable guest for this evening. And it's fun because every time Vint comes back, he gets to see how he comes. There's 30, 40 engineers here. He runs away, comes back. There's 300 and some here. So we're going to keep doing that. And we're hoping now the next time he comes back, we even have this entire building filled, and we'll continue to grow. So he's a man who needs very little introduction. He's actually the real father of the internet, despite what some Americans think about Mr. Gore. But the work that he did in creating the TCP/IP protocols is obviously what has enabled companies like Google to exist. So when he joined in September of 2005, this was a huge honor for us, and a great win to have such a visionary on board. And we're very pleased to have him. And it's with my great pleasure that I introduce Vint Cerf.
Thank you very, very much, and I really appreciate everyone's taking time out, especially in the middle of the week, in the evening, to join us. It's a real pleasure to have you here on our Google campus. I don't know where Renee LaPlante is right now, but it's her birthday today. Renee, where are you? Happy birthday. As for the crack about Al Gore, there's always some nincompoop who brings that up. Al Gore deserves credit for what he did as a senator and as vice president. He actually helped to pass legislation that enabled the NSFNet backbone to grow, and to permit commercial traffic to flow on the government-sponsored backbones in the U.S. Had he not done that, it's pretty likely that the commercial sector would not have seen an opportunity to create a commercial internet that all of us can enjoy. So he does deserve some credit for what he's done. I meant to start out, ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Es freut mich sehr, hier in Zürich wiederzukommen. And that's all the German you're going to get tonight. I did spend a very pleasant 6 months in the area around Stuttgart as a young student at Stanford University. Well, my purpose tonight is to give you a sense for what's happening to the internet today and where we think it's headed in the future. And I thought I would also take advantage of the time to give you little glimpses of what it was like in the early stages of the internet. But first, let me explain something about my title. I'm Google's chief internet evangelist. And it wasn't a title that I asked for. When I joined the company, they said, "What title do you want?" And I suggested Archduke. And they said, well, that doesn't quite fit in any of our nomenclature. And they pointed out that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. And so maybe that's not a title that you want to have. And they suggested that, considering what I've been doing for the last 35 years, that I ought to become the internet evangelist for Google. So I showed up on the first day of work wearing this outfit that I guess you see over on your right. This is the formal academic robes of the University of the Balearic Islands. And it was the most ecclesiastical outfit that I owned. So I showed up wearing that on my first day of work at Google, and Eric Schmidt took this picture. It's not often you can find an opportunity to wear something looking like that. So I took advantage of that for that one day. Well, let me just start out by reminding you of some statistics of the internet over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I would have been very excited to tell you there were 22 million machines on the internet. Now there are almost 500 million. And these are servers, the web servers, the email servers, and the like. It's not the machines that are episodically connected like laptops or personal digital assistants. The number of users on the net has grown to 1.2 billion, which sounds like a big number until you realize that there are 6.5 billion people in the world. So the chief internet evangelist has 5.3 billion people to convert to internet use. So I have a long ways to go. The other thing which has been happening in the telecom environment over the last decade has been the rapid influx of mobiles. The estimates now are that there are 3 billion by the end of this year that are in use, 2.3 billion accounts and 3 billion mobiles, which means there are 700 million people with more than one mobile. What's important to us and others in the internet environment is that many people will have their first introduction to the internet through a mobile and not through a laptop or a desktop. They're estimated to be about 10% of all the mobiles in use that are internet enabled. And so as time goes on and more of these devices become part of the landscape, an increasing number of people in the world will have their first introduction to the internet by way of a mobile as opposed to other instruments. If we look at the distribution of users on the network, the first thing that strikes me anyway is that 10 years ago North America would have been the largest absolute population of internet users, but today it's Asia, which includes China and India and Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and so on. But interestingly enough, this large number, this 460 million people, represent only 12% of the population in that region. So as they reach the same penetrations as we have, for example, in Europe at 42%, the absolute numbers of Asian users will increase. This tells you something about what to expect in terms of the content of the internet, the kinds of interests that people will have, the culture and style of use of the net will all be strongly influenced by our colleagues living in that country, not in that country, but in that region. Europe has almost 338 million users with a penetration of about 42%. I've given up trying to make any predictions at all about Europe because you keep redefining yourselves by adding countries to, so whatever happens is going to happen. Africa is at the bottom of the list here in terms of the percentage penetration. There are 1 billion people living in Africa, but very few of them, 40 million of them, have access to the internet. It's a big challenge there. The telecom infrastructures are still fairly immature. The economies vary pretty dramatically, and so getting them up and running on the internet is an important task, and one which is a significant challenge. I thought you'd find it amusing to go way back into history to see the beginnings of the predecessor to the internet, the ARPANET. There was a 4-node system that was set up in December of 1969, and I was fortunate enough to be a graduate student at UCLA in September of 1969. I programmed the software that connected a Sigma 7 computer up to the first node of the ARPANET. The Sigma 7 is now in a museum, and some people think I should be there too. But this was the beginning of wide area packet switching, and it was a grand experiment to see whether or not that technology would actually support rapid fire interactions among time-shared machines. And indeed, it worked out. The packet switch was called an IMP, an interface message processor. This is what it looked like. It was delivered by Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a very, very heavy-duty metal box. They knew that this was a military contract, and they didn't know, whether they would be dropping these things out of helicopters or what, so they put it in a very, very heavy-duty container. Considering it was installed at UCLA, surrounded by graduate and undergraduate students, probably this heavy-duty container was exactly the right thing, even if it never deployed into any other place. This picture was actually taken in 1994. It was the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET. The guy on the far left is John Postel, who all by himself managed the RFC series as the editor, managed the allocation of IP address space, and managed the delegation of top-level domains in the domain name system for over 25 years. You can imagine, though, by the time 1996 rolled around, the beginnings of the dot boom have happened. Netscape Communications has done its IPO. The general public has discovered internet, and we're off and running. John realized that that function that he performed needed to be institutionalized, and so he began a process of trying to figure out how to create an organization that would perform these functions. In the end, an organization called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was created in 1998 to take over the responsibilities of domain name management, internet address allocation, and the maintenance of all the protocol tables associated with the internet protocols. Sadly, John Postel passed away 2 weeks before ICANN was actually formally created, but it has now persisted since 1998. I had the honor of serving as chairman of the board of ICANN until just about 2 weeks ago, and I managed to escape because my sentence was up. There are term limits in the bylaws, and it said I couldn't serve anymore on the board. And frankly, I was pleased to turn this over to my successor, a man named Peter Dengate Thrush, who is from New Zealand. So the point I want to make here, apart from the amusing diagram of 1994, is that the internet is now and has always had a certain international character to it. The guy in the middle is Steve Crocker. He was the man who really blazed trails in computer network protocols. He ran what was called the Network Working Group, which was a collection of graduate students in various computer science departments around the United States, developing the first host-to-host protocols. It was called NCP for Network Computing Program, or Network Communications Program. And Steve was the primary leader that developed that protocol. It was used until 1983 when the TCP/IP protocols were introduced to a multi-network system. You'll notice that we tried to demonstrate in this picture for Newsweek how primitive computer communications was in the 1960s. It took us almost 8 hours to set up this shot, and we drew all these pictures on foolscap paper of the clouds of networks, and then we had to buy some zucchinis and yellow squash and string them together. You'll notice that this network never would work because it was either ear to ear or mouth to mouth, but there was no mouth to ear. And we did this, we posed it this way on purpose, hoping there would be a few geek readers of Newsweek who would get the joke. This is what I looked like when the TCP/IP protocols were being developed. I demonstrated not TCP/IP, but the ARPANET from South Africa in 1974. This was actually an interesting experience because we brought an acoustic coupler with us into South Africa. It was the first time that the South African telecom company had ever allowed a foreign object to be connected to their telephone system, and they were very concerned that this acoustic coupler might do damage to their network. So we managed to persuade them that it would be okay, and we connected the terminals in South Africa to the ARPANET by way of a satellite link all the way back to New York at the blazing speed of 300 bits per second. Well, the internet got started in part because Bob Kahn, the other half of the basic design of the internet, told me that in the Defense Department he was looking at how to do computers in command and control. And if you were really serious about putting computers where the military needed to be, you had to have computers running in mechanized infantry vehicles and in tanks and other things. And you couldn't pull wires behind them because the tanks would run over the wires and break them. So you needed radio for that. And you also needed to have ships at sea communicating with each other, and since they couldn't pull cables behind them because they get tangled in knots, instead you needed to have satellite communication for wide area linkages. And of course you needed wireline communication for fixed installations. So there were three networks that were part of the internet development. One was called the Packet Radio Net for mobile ground radio. Another was Packet Satellite using Intelsat 4A across the Atlantic to permit multiple ground stations to compete for access to a shared communications channel. And then the ARPANET, the predecessor, which was based on wirelines. SRI International ran the packet radio testbed in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1970s, and they built this nondescript panel van as a way of testing packet radio by driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway and occasionally stopping to make detailed measurements of packet loss, signal-to-noise ratio, the effects of shot noise from cars running back and forth nearby the van. The story goes that one day they'd pulled off to the side of the road, and the driver, who was another engineer, got out, went around and got from the cab and went around and got into the back of the van. They were making a bunch of measurements, and some police car pulled up and noticed that there was nobody in the cab, so he went around and knocked on the door. And of course they opened up the door, and this policeman looks in and he sees a bunch of hairy, geeky people with computers and displays and radios and everything else. And he says, who are you? And somebody says, oh, we work for the government. And he looks at him and he says, which government? But officer, we were only going 50 kilobits per second. Well, I remember in 1979, after we demonstrated that this technology actually worked, that we wanted to convince the U.S. Army that they ought to seriously try these out in field exercises. So I had a bunch of guys from Fort Bragg, 18th Airborne Corps, coming out to drive around in the Bayshore to actually see how it worked. And later we actually deployed packet radios at Fort Bragg for field testing. They were big 1 cubic foot devices that cost $50,000 each. They ran at 100 kilobits and 400 kilobits a second. They used spread spectrum communications. Now this is pretty advanced considering it's 1975. And of course the physical size of the radio tells you something about the nature of the electronics that were available at the time to implement this. This is a view of the inside of that van. And something else that was very interesting in all of this is that some of you will be familiar with voice over IP. Maybe many of you are using Google Talk or Skype or one of the other applications, iChat. We were testing packetized speech in the mid-1970s. So in fact, this is not such a new thing after all. In the case of the packet radio network and the ARPANET, we were trying to put packetized speech over what turned out to be a 50 kilobit backbone in the ARPANET. And all of you know that when you digitize speech, normally it's a 64 kilobit stream, so cramming 64 kilobits per second into a 50 kilobit channel is a little bit difficult. And in fact, we wanted to carry more than one voice stream in this backbone. So we compressed the voice down to 1800 bits per second using what was called linear predictive code with 10 parameters. All that means is that the voice tract was modeled as a stack of 10 cylinders whose diameter was changing as the voice would speak. And this stack was excited by a formant frequency. You would send only the diameters of each of the cylinders plus the formant frequency to the other side. You do an inverse calculation to produce sound and hope that somehow it would be intelligible on the other end. Speaking of intelligible, I am struggling right now with it's vodka. This should be very interesting by the end of it. So part of the problem with this compression ratio, going from 64 kilobits down to 1800 bits per second, is that you lose a certain amount of quality of voice. And so when you spoke through this system, it basically made everyone sound like a drunken Norwegian. And the day came when I had to, sorry about this, wow. The day came when I had to demonstrate this to a bunch of generals in the Pentagon. And I got to thinking, how am I going to do this? And then I remembered that one of the guys that was participating in this experiment was from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. His name was Ingvar Lund. And so we got the idea that we'd have him speak through the ordinary telephone system, then we'd have him speak through the packet radio system, and it sounded exactly the same. So we didn't tell the generals that everyone would sound that way if they went through the system. Today is actually a very important milestone. Today is the 30th anniversary of the first demonstration of getting all three of the original networks of the internet to interconnect and communicate with each other. We took the packet radio van was driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway radiating packets. They were intended to be delivered to USC, Information Sciences Institute in Marina del Rey, California, which is just to the west of Los Angeles. But we jiggered the gateways so that the routing would actually go from the packet radio net through the ARPANET, through an internal satellite hop down to Keller, Norway, then down by landline to University College London, then out of the ARPANET through another gateway up to a satellite ground station at Goonhilly Downs, and then up through the Intelsat 4 satellite, then down to ECAM, West Virginia, to another satellite ground station, through another gateway and back into the internet, or ARPANET, and then all the way down to USC ISI. So as the crow flies, the packets were only going 400 miles from San Francisco down to Los Angeles, but if you actually measured where the packet went, it went over 88,000 miles because it went through 2 satellite hops up and down and then across the Atlantic Ocean twice and across the United States. So we were all pretty excited about the fact that it actually worked. And I don't know about you, but I've been in the software game for a very long time. Software never works. I mean, it's just a miracle whenever it works. So we were leaping up and down, screaming, it works, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. So we celebrated this particular anniversary a couple of weeks ago at SRI International. We invited everybody who'd been involved in this particular demonstration. And quite a few people were able to come back, and we got to renew our old acquaintances. But that was a very important milestone on today, 30 years ago. Of course, if you look at the internet in 1999 or even today, this is the sort of thing you see. Highly connected, much larger, more colorful, and that's about as much as you can say about the internet. It's a pretty accurate description. It got a heck of a lot bigger over the 30-year period. Some of the things that have made the internet successful were fundamental decisions that Bob Kahn and I and others made at the beginning of this thing. One thing that we knew is that we didn't know what new switching and transmission technologies would be invented after we had settled on the design of the internet, and we did not want the net to be outmoded. We wanted it to be future-proof. So we said that we don't want the internet layer of protocol to be very aware of or dependent upon which technology was used to move packets from one point to another. We were fond of observing that all we needed from the underlying transmission system is the ability to deliver a bag of bits from point A to point B with some probability greater than 0. That's all we asked. Everything else was done on an end-to-end basis using things like TCP or UDP. In order to recover from failures or to retransmit or to weed out duplicates. So we were, I think, very well served by making that particular philosophical decision. But there was something else that also derived from that decision that I didn't fully appreciate until later. The packets not only don't care how they're being carried, but they don't know what they're carrying. They're basically ignorant of anything except that they're carrying a bag of bits. The interpretation of what's in the packets occurs at the edges of the net in the computers that are transmitting and receiving the data. The consequence of this end-to-end principle has been that people can introduce new applications in the internet environment without having to change the underlying networks and without having to get permission from the internet service providers to try out their new ideas. So when Larry and Sergey started Google, they didn't have to get permission from an ISP in order to try this idea out, or when Jeff Bezos did Amazon, or when David Filo and Jerry Yang set up Yahoo. They simply did it. And the same is true more recently when Skype was created. Nobody had to give any permission to anyone. Same is true for BitTorrent and many of the other peer-to-peer applications. Essentially, you get to do what you want to do because the underlying network is, at least up until now, very neutral about the applications. So this end-to-end principle has been an important engine for innovation in the internet in the past. Google and others believe that it should continue to be an engine of innovation, and it can only do that if the internet service providers essentially keep their hands off the applications and just simply carry bits from point A to point B. This doesn't mean that an ISP can't also have value-added applications. That's not what this means. It just means that the provider of the underlying transmission, in the case of many cases broadband transmission, that provider should not take advantage of carrying the underlying transmission to interfere with other parties competing at higher layers in the protocol for applications that might be of interest to the consumers. Similarly, the consumers who believe that they're buying access to the full internet everywhere in the world when they acquire broadband access to the net have reason to expect that no matter where they aim their packets, that the underlying system will carry them there in a non-discriminatory way. This does not mean, for example, that you must treat every single packet in the internet precisely and identically the same way. We all understand the need for control traffic with high priority. We understand the possibility that some traffic needs low latency. We understand that you may want to charge more for higher capacity at the edges of the net. Net neutrality does not mean that everything is precisely the same, but what it does mean is that there is no discrimination with regard to whose services the consumer is trying to get to or who is offering those services when it comes to traversing the broadband channels that the ISPs are providing. One other thing about broadband that's turning out to be a problem is that, at least in the United States, it's an asymmetric service. So you often can download things faster than you can upload them, leading to anomalies like you can receive high-quality video but you can't generate it. My general belief is that the consumers are going to be unsatisfied with this asymmetry and that there will be pressure to provide for uniform and symmetric broadband capacity, which is what you can get in other parts of the world. In Kyoto, you can get a gigabit per second access to the internet. It's full duplex and it costs 8,700 yen a month. It almost made me want to move to Kyoto because it just seemed like such a very friendly environment to try new things out. So we're very concerned about the symmetry and neutrality of the underlying network. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this chart, which is prepared by Jeff Houston, who's an engineer in Australia, is intended to illustrate the utilization of the IP version 4 address space. The important part of this chart is the one that's trending downward. That part is saying, basically, these are the address blocks that the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority is allocating to the regional internet registries, and that it will run out of IPv4 address blocks somewhere around the middle of 2010. The regional internet registries, yours here in Europe is the RIPE NCC, will presumably hand out portions of those address blocks. They're likely to use those up by the middle of 2011. The implication of this is there won't be any more available IPv4 address space. This doesn't mean that the network will come to a grinding halt, but what it does mean is that there won't be any more IPv4 address space, and that the only addresses that will be available for further expansion will be IPv6 addresses. Now, I have to admit that I'm personally the cause of this problem. And In around 1977, there had been a year's worth of debate among the various engineers working on the internet design about how big the address space should be for this experiment. And one group argued for 32 bits, another for 128 bits, and another for variable length. Well, the variable length guys got killed off right away because the programmers said they didn't want variable length headers because it was hard to find all the fields and you had to add extra cycles to do it. And it was hard enough to get throughput anyway, so don't do that. The 128-bit guys were saying we're going to need a lot of address space. And the other guys were saying, wait a minute, it's an experiment. 32 bits gives you 4.3 billion terminations. Now, how many terminations do you need to do an experiment? Even the Defense Department wasn't going to buy 4.3 billion of anything in order to demonstrate this technology. So they couldn't make up their minds, and I was the program manager at the time, spending money on getting this thing going. And finally I said, okay, you guys can't make up your mind. It's 32 bits. That's it. We're done. Let's go on. Well, if I could redo it, of course, I'd go back and say, let's do 128. But at the time, it would have been silly. We were using full duplex, echoplex kinds of interactions with time-shared machines and local terminals across the network. And you can imagine sending one character with 256 bits of overhead just for the addressing. It would have been silly. So we ended up with a 32-bit address space. I thought we would demonstrate the capability of the internet and that we would be convinced, if it worked, that we should then re-engineer for production. Well, we never got to re-engineer it. It just kept growing. So here we are. We're running out, and we have to use the new IPv6. By the way, if you're counting and you wonder, okay, IPv4, IPv6, what happened to IPv5? The answer is it was an experiment in a different packet format for streaming audio and video, and it led to a cul-de-sac. And we abandoned it, and the next available protocol ID was 6, so that's why we have IPv6. Now, with 128 bits of address space, you can have up to 3.4 times 10 to the 38th unique terminations. Now, I used to go around saying that means that every electron in the universe can have its own web page if it wants to. Until I got an email from somebody at Caltech, dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there's 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe. And you're off by 50 orders of magnitude. So I don't say that anymore. But it is enough address space to last until after I'm dead, and then it's somebody else's problem. Okay. I won't have time to go through very many of these, but I wanted to just emphasize that despite the fact that the internet has been around for some time now, certainly from the conceptual point of view for 35 years, there are still a whole bunch of research problems that have not been solved. Let me just pick on a couple of them that I consider to be major issues. Security is clearly a huge issue. We have browsers that are easily penetrated. They download bad Java code and turn their machines into zombies, which become part of botnets. You have problems of denial of service attacks. You have the ability to actually abuse the domain name system and turn some of its components into amplifiers of denial of service attacks, which even adds insult to injury. In multi-homing, we haven't done a very good job of that in either v4 or v6. Multi-path routing, we usually pick the best path we can, but it's only one path. If there were multiple paths between a source and destination, if we could run traffic on both of them, we'd get higher capacities. We don't do that. We don't use broadcast media at all well in the current internet architecture. When you think about it, we turn broadcast channels into point-to-point links. And it's a terrible waste if your intent was to deliver the same thing to a large number of receivers. And that could very well turn out to be a useful capability, not just for delivering things like video or audio to a large number of recipients, but software. People want to download a particular piece of software. If enough people wanted the same thing, you could schedule a transmission over a broadcast channel that would allow everyone to receive it efficiently, perhaps by satellite or over a coaxial cable or over a computer or a cable television network. So we haven't done any of those things very well. And we don't have a lot of experience with IPv6. And what's even more important, we don't have a lot of experience running two IP protocols at the same time in the same network, which is what we are going to have to do. So in order to transition, we can't simply throw a switch and say tomorrow we're using IPv6 only. We're going to have to spend years running both v4 and v6 at the same time. And we don't have a lot of experience with that. When you do two things instead of one thing, you get more possible complications. The network management systems may not know what to do when it gets errors from both v4 and v6, or worse, it gets errors from v6 but not from v4. The routing's working for one but not for the other. Do I reboot the router or not? What do I do? So there are a wide range of issues, including a very fundamental problem with IPv6. We don't have a fully connected IPv6 network. What we have is islands of IPv6. This is not the circumstance we had with the original internet. Every time we added another network, it was v4, and it connected to an already connected network. But when we start putting in v6 and not implementing it uniformly everywhere, then we're going to have islands. They could be connected by tunnels through v4. It's a very awkward proposition. Until we have assurance that we have a fully connected IPv6 network, people are going to be doing domain name lookups, getting IPv6 addresses, trying to get to them and not getting there because you're in a part of the internet that doesn't connect to the other parts of the internet that are running IPv6. So these are just headaches that are going to hit, and they're going to start hitting in 2008 because we're going to have to start, all of us are going to have to start getting v6 into operation before we actually run out of IPv4 addresses. Switching to a slightly different view of the net, there have been some really surprising social and economic effects on the net that are becoming more visible. The one that I find the most dramatic is that the information consumers are now becoming the information producers. So you could see it in the form of blogging or YouTube or Google video uploads, personal web pages, and other things. People are pushing information into the network as well as pulling it out. This is unlike any broadcast or mass medium in the past. In the past, a mass medium had a small number of information producers and a very large number of information consumers. The internet inverts all of that and allows the consumers also to produce content. Wikipedia has taught us another very interesting thing about this internet environment. I want you to think about a paragraph in Wikipedia that you're reading, and you see one word which should be changed because you're an expert in the area and you know that the statement is wrong or the sense of the paragraph is wrong. You could certainly make that one word change. You would never publish a one-word scholarly paper. You wouldn't publish a one-word book. But you can publish one word of change in a Wikipedia paragraph, and it's useful. It's a contribution to everyone who looks at that paragraph. So the internet will absorb the one-word change, the one-page change, one paper, one book, one movie, one video. It is willing to absorb information at all scales and in all formats as long as they can be digitized. So the barrier to contribution into the internet environment is essentially zero. Another phenomenon which is rapidly evolving is social networking. Many of you may already be using LinkedIn or MySpace or Facebook or Orkut or some of the others. That's a phenomenon that's going to continue to grow, especially young people enjoy interacting with each other in this new medium, and they show a considerable amount of creativity in inventing new ways of interacting with each other. Similarly, game playing, Second Life, World of Warcraft, and a bunch of others. What I'm thinking, EverQuest is another one. What's interesting about these particular environments is really twofold. One of them is that there are real people making decisions in these games, and some economists at Harvard, for example, have asked their students to go become participants in Second Life in order to observe the kinds of economic decisions that people are making in the context of these games, because they're actually trying out different economic principles within various parts of the game environment. And so it's actually an experiment that you couldn't necessarily conduct in the real world that's being conducted in this artificial environment. The other important observation I would make is that the economics of digital information are dramatically different from the economics of paper or other physical media. Just to emphasize this, let me give you a little story. I bought 2 terabytes of disk memory a few months ago for about $600 for use at home. And I remembered buying a 10 megabyte disk drive in 1979 for $1,000. And I got to thinking, what would have happened if I'd tried to buy a terabyte of memory in 1979? And when you do the math, it would have cost me $100 million. I didn't have $100 million in 1979. And to be honest with you, I don't have $100 million now either. But if I had had $100 million in 1979, I'm pretty sure my wife wouldn't let me buy $100 million worth of disk drives. She would have had a better thing to do with it. The point I want to make, though, is that that's a very dramatic drop in the cost of disk storage. You're seeing similar kinds of drops in the cost of moving bits and in processing bits electronically. The business models that you can build around those economics are very different from the business models that were built around other media, paper or other physical media. In companies that built their businesses around the older economics are going to have to learn to adapt to the new economics of online, real-time, digital processing, transmission, and storage. And if they don't figure out how to adapt to that, they'll be subject to Darwinian principles. There's a very simple principle: adapt or die. And so if you don't figure out how to adapt, it's the other, the other choice is the only one you have. So a number of companies are going to be, I would say, challenged to understand that the economics of digital information are really demanding them to rethink their business models. Doesn't want to. Hello there. This was a chart that was generated by a company called Sandvine. They're doing some deep packet inspection to understand the behavior of users at the edge of the network on a particular channel. What they were looking at here is a variety of applications that are visible as the packets are traversing back and forth over access lines. What was important here is that the YouTube traffic represented somewhere between 5 and 10% of all the traffic that they measured on this particular access channel. And I bring this up primarily to say that YouTube is only 2 years old. So just look at what happened with an application very recently suddenly blossoming into a fairly highly demanding application in terms of capacity on the network. We can easily imagine that other applications will be invented that may have different profiles of demand for traffic, either uploading or downloading, or maybe low latency or many other things. So the point here is that the network is very dynamic. It is constantly changing. New applications are coming along, making new demands on its capacity. And so this is not stable in the same sense that the telephone network was stable, where you could use air-long formulas to predict how many lines you needed to keep people from getting a busy signal below 1% probability. The internet does not have stable statistics like that, and because new applications can be invented simply by writing a new piece of software, I think we're not ever going to be able to predict very well the actual behavior of the net at the edge. In the core of the net, it's a different story, because you're aggregating a large number of flows and you can get fairly stable statistics for the core of the net, but not at the edge. I've been thinking a lot about how the economics of digital storage and transmission have an effect on certain kinds of media, like video in particular. Let's just take a moment, a couple of observations. 15% of all the video that people watch is real-time video. It's being produced in real time. It's a news program. It's an emergency or maybe a sporting event. 85% of the video that people watch is actually pre-recorded material. So in this chart, there are two kinds of video: RT for real-time video that's being generated in real time, and PR for pre-recorded video that's being transmitted through the network. And imagine now that we've got two axes. One is the transmission rate that's available to you as a consumer, and the other is the storage you have available locally. And the split is high transmission rate means it's sufficiently high to deliver things in real time. And low means you can't deliver it in real time. Low storage means there isn't enough memory locally to store any reasonable amount of video. High means there's enough storage to store reasonable amounts, which might be measured in hours of video. So the question is, where are you in this? Which quadrant are you in as the consumer? If you're in the lower left-hand quadrant where you can't transmit in real time and you don't have any place to store it, you're basically out of luck. Video is not an interesting medium for you. If you have very high transmission rates and no storage available, you can easily receive the streams in real time, just as you would over a typical cable or satellite or over-the-air transmission system. You can even potentially receive the pre-recorded material at higher than real-time speeds, but since you don't have any place to store them, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So basically in the upper left, you're stuck with streaming video in real time. In the upper right, it's much more interesting because here you have high speed available and you have a lot of storage available. The real-time stream could be delivered and watched in real time. It could be delivered in real time and stored away and watched later, just like TiVo or other personal video recorders. But it's the pre-recorded stuff that gets really interesting. You could clearly transmit it in real time, but you can also transmit it faster than real time because you have a data rate that exceeds the rate at which the video is normally transmitted for viewing. The implication of this is that video on demand no longer means streaming video. It means delivering video potentially faster than you could watch it. Anybody that uses an iPod today is experiencing that because you're downloading music faster than you could listen to it, and then you play it back at your leisure whenever you want to. It's my belief that IPTV is going to be the download and playback style of iPod as long as the data rates at the edges of the net are sufficiently high. So what does that mean for the television industry? And I'd like to use the word television here to refer to a business model and the word video to refer to the medium. And so my interest here is understanding what happens to the video medium and the business of video when it ends up into an internet environment. One thing that's very clear is that because you've packetized everything when you're downloading it, the data that you're downloading doesn't have to be confined to video and audio. It could easily contain other information. So when you get a DVD and it has bonus components on it, it's bonus videos, it's textual material, maybe it's the biographies of the actors or the story of how the movie was made or the book that the movie was based on. So when we're downloading stuff associated with video and it's coming through the internet, we can download all forms of digitized content, store it away, and then access it later. Among the things that could be downloaded is advertising material. In the conventional video world, you interrupt the video for an advertisement and you force it on the users, on the consumers. In the world of internet-based systems, when you're playing back the recorded content, there's a program, a computer, which is interpreting the traffic and interpreting the data. And so it's not just a stupid raster scan device. It can actually make decisions based on the kind of information that's being pulled up. So imagine that you've composed an entertainment video and that you made some of the objects in the field of view, like maybe this Macintosh is sitting in the field of view. You made those objects detectable or sensitive to mousing. So if you mouse over that particular object, it highlights and a window pops open and says, gee, I see you're looking at the Macintosh. Let me tell you a little bit more about that product. Click here if you'd like to find out whether there are any available at the Apple Store. By the way, do you want to complete the transaction now and then go back to watching the movie? The idea of allowing the users to mouse around in the field of view of an entertainment video is a transforming idea with regard to advertising. And it feels a little funny, you know, a computer programmer like me sitting up here getting excited about advertising, but remember that that's where Google makes all of its revenue. So we care a lot about new styles of advertising that would improve the consumer's control over what advertising he or she has to be exposed to. And also, it turns out the advertisers care a lot about knowing whether the users are interested in their products. And so knowing that nobody is, if they're not interested, they don't click. If they are, they do, and that is a big jump up in understanding something about the potential client for your products or your services. So my prediction is that video in the internet environment where high-speed interfaces are available and lots of storage are available will be a transforming opportunity for users to control advertising and for advertisers to wind up with a much better product than they have today. I mentioned mobiles before, and I just want to emphasize that these are programmable devices. These are not just telephones anymore. Google recently announced an operating system called Android that we would like to make available to anyone who's building these wireless platforms. The purpose is to open up the platform so that you can download new applications and allow users to try out new things without too much difficulty. These things are already useful for accessing information on the net. Here, especially in Europe, they're being used to make payments. This is a challenge, though. I mean, if I've got a BlackBerry here and it has a screen that's the size of a 1928 television set, and the data rates that you can reach this thing with vary from tens of kilobits a second to maybe as much as a megabit. And the keyboard is just great for anybody who's 3 inches tall. So these are pretty limiting devices. But it seems to me that they are going to be very important because of the prevalence of these devices, especially in areas where alternative access to the internet isn't available. What is interesting about these is that because you carry them around on your person or in your purse, they become your information access method, your information source. And often you want information which is relevant to where you are at the moment. So geographically indexed information is becoming very, very valuable and very important, especially as you access it through mobiles. I have a small anecdote to share, which emphasized for me the importance of having access to geographically indexed information. My family and I went on a vacation this May in a place called Page, Arizona. It's adjacent to something called Lake Powell. We decided to rent a houseboat. And believe me, if you like steering things around, don't rent a houseboat. The thing, it steers like a houseboat. I mean, you know. Anyway, I was terrified that I was just going to ricochet my way down the lake. But in any case, the problem is once you get on the boat, there's no place to get any food. So you have to prepare by buying food and bringing it on board. So as we were driving into Lake Powell, we were discussing what meals we were going to produce. And somebody said, well, I want to make paella. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. You need saffron to do that. Where am I going to find saffron in this little town of Page, Arizona? So fortunately, I got a good GPRS signal, so I pulled out the BlackBerry and I went to Google and I said, Page, Arizona, grocery store, saffron. And up popped a response with an address, a telephone number, name of the store, and a little map to show you how to get there. So I clicked on the telephone number. And of course, this being a telephone, it made the call, the phone rang. Somebody answered and I said, could I please speak to the spice department? Now, this is a little store, right? So it's probably the owner that this is the spice department. I said, do you have any saffron? He said, I don't know. And he went off, he came back, he says, yeah, I got some. So we followed the map. This is all happening in real time. We followed the map, drive into the parking lot, and I ran in and bought $12.99 worth of saffron. That's 0.06 ounces, in case you wondered. And we went off on Lake Powell. We made a really nice paella. What really struck me is that I was able to get information that was relevant to a specific need in real time and execute this transaction. It would not have worked. I mean, can you imagine going and trying to find something in the white pages or the yellow pages at a gas station or what have you? The fact that you can get information that is useful to you in real time is really quite striking. So I believe that as this mobile revolution continues to unfold, that geographically indexed information is going to be extremely valuable. Hello, this doesn't want to wake up. There we are. Well, some of you have been around for a while and have watched the internet grow. I've been a little stunned at some of the devices that are starting to show up on the network, like internet-enabled refrigerators or picture frames that download images off of websites and then cycle through them automatically, or things that look like telephones but they're actually voice-over IP computers. But the guy that really stunned me is the fellow in the middle. He's from San Diego. He made an internet-enabled surfboard. I guess he was sitting out on the water thinking, you know, if I had a laptop in my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting to surf the Pacific Ocean. So he built a laptop into his surfboard and he put a Wi-Fi service in the rescue shack back on the beach. And he now sells this as a product. So, you know, if you're interested in buying an internet-enabled surfboard, he's the guy to go to. I honestly think that there are going to be billions of devices on the net, more devices than there are people. And if you think about the number of appliances that serve you every day,
There are lots of them, and imagine that they're all online. Imagine being able to interact with them or use intermediary services to interact with them. So as an example, instead of having to interact directly with your entertainment systems, if they were up on the network and accessible that way, you might interact through a web page on a service on the network, which then turns around and takes care of downloading movies that you want to watch or music that you want to listen to, or moving content from one place to another. All of that could be done through the internet. In fact, a lot of those devices have remote controls, and if you're like me, there are lots of them. And then you fumble around trying to figure out which remote control goes with which box. And after you figure that out, that's the remote control with the dead battery. So the idea here is to replace all of those with your mobile, which is internet enabled. So are the devices in the room. You program them and interact with them through the internet. So you don't even have to be in the same room. Gee, you don't even have to be in the house. You could be anywhere in the world where you could get access to the internet and you could control your entertainment systems. Of course, so could the 15-year-old next door. And so you clearly need strong authentication in order to make sure only the authorized users of these systems are controlling your entertainment system or your heating and ventilation or your security. All of these things could easily be online. Lots of appliances at home, appliances in the office, all manageable through the internet. And offering opportunities for third parties to help manage some of that equipment for you. So this kind of network of things is creating opportunities for people to offer new products and services. I don't have time to go through all of these various examples, but there are little scenarios you can cook up. Like the refrigerator that's online. If your families are like American families, the communication medium between American families is generally paper and magnets on the front of the refrigerator. And you now, if you put up a nice laptop interface on the front of the refrigerator door, you can communicate with family members by blogging, by instant messaging, and by web pages and email. But it gets more interesting if you imagine that the refrigerator has an RFID detector inside. And RFID chips are on the products that you put inside the refrigerator. So now the refrigerator can know what it has inside. And while you're at work, it's surfing the internet looking for recipes that it knows it could make with what it has inside. So when you get home, you see a nice list of things to have for dinner, if you like. And you can extrapolate this. You might be on vacation and you get an email. It's from your refrigerator. It says, I don't know how much yogurt is left, but you put it in there 3 weeks ago and it's going to crawl out on its own. Or maybe your mobile goes off. It's an SMS from your refrigerator. Don't forget the marinara sauce. I have everything else I need for spaghetti dinner tonight. Now, unfortunately, the Japanese have spoiled this beautiful scenario. They've invented an internet-enabled bathroom scale. When you step on the scale, it figures out which family member you are based on your weight, and it sends that information to the doctor to become part of your medical record. And of course, that's okay, except for one problem. The refrigerator is on the same network. So when you come home, you see diet recipes coming up on the display. Or maybe it just refuses to open because it knows you're on a diet. I'm going to skip over. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. There's some important stuff here. I mentioned earlier IPv6, and that's something that is a major transformation of the core part of the internet at the internet protocol layer. There are other things that are happening in 2007 and now 2008 that are going to have an impact on all of us who offer various kinds of internet service. One thing is the introduction of non-Latin top-level domains, internationalized domain names, that are written in character sets that include things like Arabic and Cyrillic and Hebrew and Chinese of various kinds and kanji and Hangul and so forth. ICANN has already put up 11 test languages in the top-level domains in the root zone file. And it's encouraging people to go there and to try out interactions with those domain names using various application software packages, including browsers, to give you a chance, and also email, to give you a chance to see how the software will interact with these non-Latin character domain names. They're represented typically in Unicode. They may be Unicode encoded in UTF-8, for example. But what's important is that the software has to recognize that these are domain names, even though they're expressed using strings other than simply A through Z and 0 through 9 and a hyphen. The other thing which is going on is digital signing of domain name entries. So DNSSEC is a way of allowing someone who's doing a domain name lookup to ask for a digitally signed answer. And when that comes back, you have some validation that the information in that domain name entry has not been altered, that it has maintained integrity from the time it was put in. This is not encrypting anything. It is simply a question of digitally signing things to make sure that the information is still valid, or as valid as it was when it went in the first place. Those things are all underway now in the internet, and they may have an impact on every one of us that are involved in building systems that run on the internet. I'd like to just quickly go through a couple of other points here. One of them is that intellectual property handling in the online environment is becoming quite a challenge. Digitized information is easy to copy and it's easy to distribute. The philosophy behind copyright laws, including the Berne Convention that was developed here in Switzerland, says that physical copies of things are what we are concerned about. And the difficulty of copying or the cost of copying physical objects is what has made that particular law work reasonably well. But in the presence of digital versions of these things, it's turning out to be much harder to enforce. It may very well be that we need to back away and rethink what copyright means in this online and digital environment. There are alternatives that have been suggested. Creative Commons is one of them, celebrating its 5th anniversary this year, that may find alternative ways of compensating authors, or of letting authors say whether they want to be compensated or in what way they want to be compensated for their intellectual property that's been put into this online environment. Tim Berners-Lee has worked for some time and spoken often about the semantic web. This is an idea that allows us to interact with the content of the network, not just with strings, but with some notion of the meaning of the strings. That project is still a work in progress. If, in fact, it's possible to codify or otherwise indicate the meaning of contents on the net, it would be very beneficial, certainly from Google's point of view, because today we tend to navigate you to a document, but what you really wanted was answers. And in order to do a better job of helping you find answers, we need to understand the semantics of what's in the net, and right now we can't do that. I am becoming increasingly concerned about the nature of the objects that are in the internet today. Some of them are extremely complex. They're not interpretable without software. A spreadsheet, for example, is a dead thing until you actually bring it up in the spreadsheet program and interact with it. It's a very complex object sitting on the net somewhere. You can't simply print it out. Well, you can, but you get a very limited representation of the real content, meaning, and complexity of the objects. So I'm concerned that over time, the contents that we put into the internet will be dependent on software to interpret what the bits mean. That leads me to my biggest worry, which I'll call bit rot. If, in fact, bits are stored away over time and they're moved from one medium to another as new storage media come along, what will happen if we lose access to the software that knows how to interpret the bits? At that point, you won't know what you have other than a bag of bits. And so the question is, what can we do about that? Let me give you a scenario. It's the year 3000. And you've just gone through a Google search and you've turned up a PowerPoint file from 1997. So let's suppose you're running Windows 3000. The question is, does Windows 3000 know how to interpret the 1997 PowerPoint? And the chances are it does not. And this is not an arbitrary dig at Microsoft. Even if this were open source software, the probability that you would maintain backward compatibility for 1,000 years strikes me as being fairly low. So the question is what to do if you're thinking about information that you want to be accessible 1,000 years from now, like vellum documents are today that are 1,000 years old. We have to start thinking about how to preserve software that will be able to interpret the bits that we keep saving. You may even have to go so far as to save the operating system that knew how to run the application that could interpret the bits, and maybe even emulate hardware that ran the operating system that knows how to run the application that can interpret the bits. there is very, very little progress made right now in that domain, something that we should be very concerned about. Otherwise, 1,000 years from now, historians will wonder what the heck we did in the 21st century. There will be nothing about us other than a pile of rotting bits. And that's all they will know, is that we were the rotten bit generation. And I'm sure that's not what we want them to know about us. Okay, last update. And then I have a whole bunch of questions here that people have asked already, and I'll try to answer some of them. This project that I'm about to tell you about is not a Google project. Google lets me have time to work on it, but I don't want you to walk out of this auditorium saying, ha, I figured out what Google's business plan is. It's going to take over the solar system. That's not what this is about. This is about supporting the exploration of the solar system using standardized communication protocols. Because historically, we have not standardized these communication systems as in the same way that we've standardized communication in the internet. Now, we all know that we've been exploring Mars using robotic equipment. Usually, to communicate with the spacecraft, we use the Deep Space Network, which was developed in 1964. These are big 70-meter dishes in Goldstone, California, Madrid, Spain, and Canberra, Australia. There are also adjacent 35-meter antennas, as well as half of one is kind of visible over in the right-hand corner of that image. So as the Earth rotates, these big deep space dishes are rotating along and seeing out into the solar system, able to communicate with spacecraft like this one, which may be in orbit around a planet or flying past an asteroid, or in some cases actually landing on the surface of a planet like the rovers did in 2004. One thing that you might not know is that most of the communication protocols that are used for these deep space missions are tailored to the sensor platforms, the sensors that are on board the spacecraft platforms, in order to make most efficient use of the available communication capacity, which is often fairly limited. The rovers that went onto Mars in the beginning of 2004 are still running, which is pretty amazing considering their original mission time was only 90 days. So they're still in operation, although one of them, I forget which one, has a broken wheel and it's kind of dragging furrows in the Martian soil. But they're still operational. One of the problems that showed up, though, very early in the rover mission is that the plan was to transmit data with the high-gain antenna. It's the kind of, I don't have a cursor here, but there's a thing that looks like a pie tin on the right-hand side. That was the high-gain antenna that was supposed to transmit data straight back to the Deep Space Network from the surface of Mars. When they turned the radios on and started transmitting, they overheated. And it happened on both spacecraft, so it was a design problem. So they had to reduce the duty cycle to avoid having the radio damage itself, which really drove the principal investigators crazy because 28 kilobits wasn't very much to begin with, and now it's less frequent transmissions. So the guys at JPL figured out a way to essentially reconfigure systems so that the data could be transmitted from the rover up to an orbiter, and there were 4 orbiters available around Mars. They were reprogrammed in order to take the data up on a 128 kilobit radio, a different radio, which didn't have very far to go. So the signal to noise ratio was high enough to get much higher data rates. Then the data was stored in the orbiter until it got around to the point where it could transmit the data to the Deep Space Net. And once again, it could transmit at 128 kilobits a second, partly because the orbiters had bigger solar panels and more power available than the rovers on the surface. So the net result is that all the information that's coming back from the rovers is going through a store and forward system, which of course is the way the internet works. This reconfirmed an idea that my colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Lab and I have been pursuing since 1998. And that's the definition of protocols to run an interplanetary extension of the internet. Basically, we assume we're running TCP/IP on the surface of the planets and in the spacecraft. Those are low latency environments. TCP/IP works very well there. We thought we could get away with running TCP/IP for the interplanetary part, and that idea lasted about a week. It's pretty obvious what the problem is. When Earth and Mars are farthest apart in their orbits, they're 235 million miles apart. And it takes 20 minutes one way at the speed of light for a signal to propagate. And you can imagine how flow control would work with TCP. You'd say, okay, I'm out of room now, stop. The guy at the other end doesn't hear you say that for 20 minutes. Of course, he's transmitting like crazy, and then the packets are falling all over the place. It doesn't work. To make matters worse, there's this thing called celestial motion. The planets have this nasty habit of rotating. And so you can imagine you're trying to talk to a rover on the surface of Mars, and after a while it rotates out of sight, and you can't talk to it until it gets back around to the other side, so the communication is disrupted. So we concluded very quickly that we were faced with a delay and disruption problem and needed to invent a set of protocols that built that into its assumptions, which were frankly not part of the internet assumptions, the TCP/IP protocols. So we developed a set of protocols. We've been going through tests of them. We've got to the point now where we have publicly available software. It's all up on the DTNRG website, Delay and Disruption Tolerant Networking Research Group.org. That protocol has now been tested in terrestrial environments. We picked two. The Defense Department, DARPA, funded the original interplanetary architecture work. And after we got done and realized that this DTN thing was a serious problem, we realized that they had a problem in tactical communication. Same problem, disruption, delay, uncertain delay. So we went back and said, we think you have a problem, and we think you could use the DTN protocols for tactical military communication. So they said, okay, prove it. And we said, okay. We went off and we built some, these motes that come from Berkeley, the little Linux operating systems. We built a bunch of motes and put the DTN protocols on board. And then we went to the Marine Corps and we said, okay, we'd like to test this stuff out. What application would you like to run? And they said, chat. And I said, are you kidding? You're sitting here with bullets whizzing by and you're going like this? And they said, yes, because chat has the nice feature that when you reconnect, all the exchanges that took place are then given to you that you missed. And so you get back in sync with the other people who are part of this communications environment. So we said, well, okay. So we did that. We implemented it. We went out to Northern Virginia to a test deployment of these things with the Marine Corps, and it worked. And so, I thought that was pretty cool, a demonstration of DTN working terrestrially, something useful coming out of all this. And the next thing I knew, they'd taken all of our stuff to Iraq. And I said, wait a minute, it's an experiment. And they said, no, it isn't. And off they went. So we said, all right, fine. Then we thought, well, let's try this in a more civilian environment as well. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the fact that the reindeer herders, the Sami, are in the northern part of Sweden and Finland and Norway and Russia. And they are pretty isolated because they're so far north. And satellite communication is a problem because the dishes are banging right down on the horizon. So we said, well, what would happen if we stuck a laptop with 802.11 in it and the DTN protocols in an all-terrain vehicle, and we put a Wi-Fi service in the villages? So we tried one village, and we tried this sort of random interaction with the system using DTN, and it worked. That was last year. So next year we're going to try a multiple village test of the DTN protocols to see whether it works, and if it works out well enough, then maybe we'll put these things in the snowmobiles so that they'll work both during the summer and the winter. So we're very happy that we've got terrestrial examples of the use of the DTN protocols. We're now at the point where we're ready to start space-based testing. 2009, we're hoping to put the DTN protocols on board the International Space Station, and in 2011, NASA has offered to allow us to put the protocols on board the Deep Impact spacecraft that already completed its primary mission, which was to launch a probe into a comet and gather data back, but it's still out there and it's still functioning. So somewhere around 2011, we hope to space qualify the DTN protocols, and after that, Adrian Hook, who's my counterpart now at NASA, is also chairman of the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems, and we hope to introduce that as a standard protocol for use in space communication. So what we're expecting, if we're lucky, is that the space agencies around the world will adopt this as a standard. They'll use it for every mission that they launch, and that means that every time you launch a new mission, any previous mission assets that are available can become part of the support structure for the newly launched mission. What will happen as a result is that we'll accrete an interplanetary backbone over a period of decades as more and more of these missions get launched in the system. So let me stop there, and thank you again for taking all this time, and we'll see whether we can answer a few questions here, if that's okay with you. So these are questions that apparently were submitted by many of you here, and I'll answer a few, and then we'll see if we get some immediate ones from the floor. First company says, for many companies, the breakdown of the internet for, say, 3 days would lead to a substantial damage. Question, is it possible to estimate the probability of such a breakdown of the entire internet? And if so, how could it be down, and are there any numbers available? Or maybe how could it be done? I think the answer is, I'm not going to tell you how it could be done. The answer is that the probability that the entire internet could be taken down seems to be pretty small. There have been plenty of opportunities over the past 20 years or so since the 1983 rollout of internet to destroy it in one way or another. And even in spite of the fact that denial of service attacks are by far one of the most serious threats to internet stability, it seems unlikely that the entire internet would be taken down. I will observe, however, that we manage to shoot ourselves in the foot fairly regularly by misconfiguring things. So if you misconfigure the routing tables of the routers, you can easily damage significant parts of the internet. And we seem to do that with more frequency than we would like. But I think on the whole, the robustness of the system has been pretty substantial. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be introducing increasing amounts of security mechanisms into the network in order to limit that risk. What's the biggest fallacy about the internet? Well, one of them is that Al Gore didn't have any, or Al Gore invented it. He didn't invent it, but he did have something to do with it. The other big fallacy is some people think the internet happened because a bunch of local area networks got together one day and said, let's build a multi-network system. The fact is that it started with wide area networks, and it took a long time. Will there ever be secure web apps based on a browser alone? Would apps be more secure if run in applets? Boy, that's a really good question. Right now, the most vulnerable part of the internet world is the browser. Browsers ingest Java code or other high-level codes, and they often are unable to detect that this code is actually trying to take over the machine or install a Trojan horse or do some other damaging thing. If we were we collectively were to invest anything at all, I think we should be investing in building much, much smarter browsers that are able to defend against some of the dangerous downloads. Should the evolution of the basic protocols such as HTTP go, or where should it go in order to support more asynchronous interactions of Web 2.0? And a related question, is there too much overhead in HTTP? Well, first of all, I'd say that we should not depend solely on HTTP as the medium of interaction on the net. Peer-to-peer applications are really interesting. And although some of them get abused for copying and distributing material as copyright, in fact, they often are a very efficient way of linking people who want to communicate in the network, either pairwise or in multiple groups. So my reaction right now to this one is that we really should be looking at asynchronous peer-to-peer kinds of interactions in addition to the more classical HTTP designs. Can the World Wide Web help humanity to become a just democratic society? Well, the short answer to that is no. Probably not, although to be really honest and fair, the internet probably is the most democratic communication system that we've ever had because it allows so many people to introduce content and to share it and exchange it. But humanity is what it is. Shakespeare keeps telling us about them. That's why the plays are still so interesting. So for humanity to become a just and democratic society is going to take a fair amount of adjustment of the human beings who make up that society, not just the technology that surrounds them. Authentication on the internet typically means complete identification. How can the privacy of users be protected? The answer is that we need to do both. We need to have anonymous access to the internet, and we also need to have the ability to do strong authentication. And the reason that you want to do both is that sometimes it's important to be anonymous. We all understand you can abuse the anonymity and do bad things and stalk people and say things that are not true. But there are also times when it's important to be anonymous in order to allow whistleblowing. So I think on the other side, there are transactions that we want to produce or engage in for which we really do need to know who the other party is. And so we want strong mechanisms to allow people to validate each other to themselves or to validate the website to you. And at the same time, we also have to support anonymity, and I think we need both. I'll tell you what, there are a list of almost 23 questions here, and I have the feeling that there are probably people in the audience who would like to ask some questions that they didn't ask ahead of time. So let me stop with the pre-asked questions and ask if there's anybody who would like to ask a question live from the floor. There's a microphone down here, and there's a brave soul who wants to ask a question. I promise I won't spit. And if there aren't any, I'll be happy to either go on or maybe run off the stage. Let's see. What do you think when do you think ownership of the top DNS will be transferred from the U.S. government to an international organism such as the UN? Well, I'll be honest and say I hope it doesn't get transferred to an international organism such as the UN. I think that transfer of the ICANN operation to a multilateral organization would politicize it. I'd point out that ICANN is a multi-stakeholder organization, which means that governments, the private sector, the technical community, the general public have access to the process of policy making for the domain name system and internet address allocation. It would be much better for this process to end up in a multi-stakeholder structure, not a multilateral structure like the UN. The Internet Governance Forum just finished its meetings in Rio de Janeiro. It too is a multi-stakeholder organization. And the conversations that take place among those different stakeholders, I think, are extraordinarily illuminating when it comes to seeing what the different perspectives are about policy. So I hope that the answer is, first, it doesn't end up in a multilateral group, but rather a multi-stakeholder one. And I would suggest that there isn't very much more to be done to extract the U.S. government role here. All it does right now in the Department of Commerce is to validate that ICANN has followed its procedures to do delegations of top-level domains, and that's all it does. It's never forced any decisions on ICANN. It's never rejected any recommendations that ICANN has made. This isn't to say that people would like to see the U.S., many of them, not have this special relationship, and I hope that sometime, certainly in 2008, there's an opportunity to revisit that relationship when we review what's now called the Joint Project Agreement between the Department of Commerce and ICANN. Okay, well, let me stop there, and if there aren't any questions, I think maybe we can wrap up. I don't know whether you would like to say a closing benediction?
No, I just would like to say thanks to Vint Cerf. Phenomenal.